Hello, my lovely class. Welcome to StudyWave Academy, where education is without limits. Okay, welcome to class. Welcome to our English class, and let's continue exploring our main topic for today, and that is literature. So, literature is a very fun topic, very exciting, very easy to understand, and you'll notice when we continue growing and continue moving to different levels or different grades, we will find this literature as a topic on its own or as a subject on its own, and it's a fun topic where you're able to read what other writers have done, look at the different works that different writers have done, and just understand their works. So we looked at what literature is, and I told you just any spoken or written work that is presented artistically or in an intellectual manner. I introduced you to literature and even all forms of literature. I told you about the fiction, non-fiction, poetry, drama, all these forms of literature, and we were able to understand that. Okay, then I took you through the different genres of literature, and I told you genres are just the types of literature, different categories of literature. And I told you we have various genres. We have imagery, we have creative and where I told you we we have different genres, where I talked about fiction being just imaginative stuff where you imagine or invent characters or invent your own story. So that is the fiction, do not forget. I talked about another genre as non-fiction. Non-fiction are true story, factual stories, things that have happened, things that have occurred. Okay, so we have non-fiction too. So we have these genres here. We also have the poetry, we have drama, we have prose. Okay, so those are the different genres of literature. Another thing that literature entails, we looked at the literary elements, and these were elements such as the plot, characters, setting, themes, point of view, and symbolism. Okay, so these are other things that literature entails. We looked at the analytical skills. Okay, we looked at all these types of what literature entails. Then we went to the purpose of literature, discussed the purpose, and discussed various examples of purpose of literature and why we need to study this literature. Okay, after looking at the purpose, we moved to the functions of literature, understood what literature is and its function. Okay, so right now I want us to move to something very important, and that is the types of literature. The types of literature, I introduced you to some of them earlier, but right now we're going to be looking at the types of literature in depth. So let's jog in or dive deep into this. So literature comes in various types or genres. Like I said, genres are also called types. Okay, so literature comes in various genres or various types. So each is unique or has unique characteristics and purpose. So here are some common types of literature. So we're going to be looking at the different types of literature and different works of literature. Okay, so we have fiction. I've already talked about fiction and I told you about fiction, and I told you what fiction is. So with fiction, one thing you have to know is that fiction is something not true. So you can tell yourself something that is not true is called fiction. So the first type or the first genre is fiction. Okay, so we have fiction for something that is not true. So the first one is fiction, and we say fiction literature presents or fiction narratives are just fictional literature presents imagery, stories, and characters often created by the author's imagination. So this is where you sit and you will think of maybe dogs talking, or a talking dog, a talking cat, a flying animal, or a flying person. Okay, so fiction is something that is not true. Don't forget about that. So that is the first example or the first type of literature. For example, we have This Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. It's a novel featuring fictional characters and their relationships. Okay, we have Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Okay, it's again a fantasy epic with fictional creatures. So class, the way you just seated, try share or try tell me some fiction stories that you know or fiction movies that you've watched where you feel like this is just someone's imagination and it's something not true. You've seen maybe tables move, or cats talk, such things. Try think of any fiction stories that you've seen or that you've heard or that you've watched or read, okay? So the first type here is the fiction stories and I've explained what fiction stories are. Again, fiction stories are things that are not true. They're imagined stories, okay? Their characters are imagined. You want to have characters like animals, characters maybe like kitchen utensils, okay? So don't forget about this. So that is the fiction stories, okay? So that's the first type of a fiction narrative. Now let's move to the second type, and that is the non-fiction. So when we talk about non-fiction, these are basically just true or factual stories, okay? This consists of factual, informative, and real life narratives. So these are stories that actually happened, okay? And I've given you an example is a biography, and I've told you we have biography and autobiography. So again, in our vocabulary corner, let's write this word biography. So basically, biography is just a story that someone else has written about another person. So now, for example, if I tell you write a biography about your mom, you will write everything about your mom and include when she was born, the school she went to, how she grew, everything about your mom. So if you're writing about your mother, then that is biography, okay? But if you write something about yourself, I tell you write an autobiography, that now you're writing about yourself. So the author is writing about himself or herself, then that is what we call autobiography. But with biography, it's something another person writes about you, okay? Don't forget about that. So we have these non-fiction narratives, and these are just factual or true or real narratives, things that actually happened, events that happened to people, okay? So we call them the fiction narratives. I've given examples here, and again, it's not important for you to really understand these examples. It was just for those people who might have heard or come across them, or even read or watched some of these examples that I've given. But again, so the first one we've looked at, the first type is the fiction narrative, and I've told you what they are. The second type is the non-fiction narrative, and again, I've explained what that is, okay? So don't forget about that. Let's move on and look at the next type. The next type, we have poetry, okay? So we have poetry, and we know what poems are. I believe that now in grade 7 we know what poems are. We know what poems entail. And poetry is a form of literature that uses structured and often rhythmic language to convey emotions, ideas, or imagery. So if I tell you to maybe someone come to the front of the class, or someone just stand and try tell us a poem, or just narrate or share a poem with us, you can do this because we know what poems are. Poems are just a form of literature that uses structured language, okay? It uses a specific language to pass its information. So you'll realize with poetry, you were able to form ideas in your mind. When someone is narrating a poem, when someone is performing a poem in front of you, you're able to see how they convey this in a structured manner. So poems are written in stanzas. Poems are written in they're written in short lines, okay? We call stanzas, yes. So the first stanza, second stanza, okay? So but that is not important. Just know that poems are written in this way, okay? They have a structure in how they are written. They have a specific way in how they're supposed to be written, okay? So those are the poems. So poem is another type of literature that I don't want you to forget about. I've given you an example of a poem here by The Raven by Edgar Allan, and it's a famous narrative poem known for its dark and mysterious atmosphere. We have another poem there. So if you're a fan of poems, again, I want to tell you to go ahead, do research, find out about this poem, find about other poems, read them, and just enlighten yourself. Find more knowledge about what poems are, okay? So just know these types of literature are what we call the genres of literature. So right here I told you about one thing that must be evident in poems or in narratives or in literature, So one thing that is very important for all literature work is the genres. So I talked about the genres, and I talked about the genres being different types of poem. I talked about fiction and non-fiction genre, okay? I talked about poetry, drama, and prose. So already I've told you about fiction, I've told you about non-fiction, and now I'm telling you about the poetry here. So these are what we call the genres, and this is what we're talking about here when we talk about the different types of poetry or different types of literature. Sorry, I don't know why poetry is stuck in my mind, because I'm talking about poetry now as another type of literature. Okay, so I've told you about fiction, and I don't want you to forget, class. Do not forget that fiction, I know most of us can confuse between fiction and non-fiction. It's really something we can confuse, but do not confuse yourself. It's easy to understand. Fiction is something that is not true. And non-fiction is something that is true. Perfect. So that is where you stop at. Fiction is just something that is not true, and fiction is something that is not true, and non-fiction is something that is true. Okay, so that's where you stop from. When you talk about fiction, these are imaginary things where an author tries to imagine about cap stalking, imagine about animal stalking. Okay, so that is what fiction is. But non-fiction, these are true things where you don't imagine, you don't guess things. No, these are really things that happen, events that happen. So you're talking about a true story, you're talking about a true event. So that is what we call non-fiction. Okay, and I've given you examples there. Don't forget, don't confuse between the two. And I've given you an example of a non-fiction here, example of a non-fiction, and I talked about a biography and an autobiography. Again, do not confuse yourself on these two terms. When you talk about a biography, it's just something or a text or just something you write about someone else. I've given you an example. When I tell you, write about your mother. When you write about your mother and everything about her life and all that went down, you're basically writing a biography, because it's something you're writing about someone else. Okay, but when I tell you to write about yourself, tell me about yourself and write it down, then that is an autobiography. And autobiography is where you're writing about yourself, no one else but yourself. Okay, so don't forget that difference, biography and autobiography, and those are all part of the non-fiction stories, of non-fiction narratives, or part of the non-fictional literature, because they are true. A story about your mom is true, a story about yourself is true, so they fall under the non-fiction part. Okay, then I went to look at the poems, okay, or poetry. And with poetry, I've told you they're written in a structured way, whereby they have rhythm. You notice even in poem we have rhyming words, so that these rhyming words bring some rhythm with them. So when you're saying a poem or when you're reciting a poem, you feel some rhythm, and this rhythm is what we talk about, or this rhythm is what brings about the poem being nice, and the poem being easy to master and easy to fun to listen to. Okay, so don't forget about that in poetry. Okay, let's continue and look at another type. But before we look at that, remember there's a difference between poetry and prose, and we'll be able to look at that even in a further discussion. So right now we'll talk about drama. So what is drama? When you hear drama, what comes into your mind? So basically, drama is just a form of literature that is written for performance and typically includes dialogue and stage directions. So drama, one feature about drama is that there must be characters. There must be different people who talk or who exchange a conversation. Okay, so with drama, there must be a dialogue. Do we know what a dialogue is? So a dialogue is basically just communication between two or more people. Maybe you're having a dialogue with your mom, a dialogue is family members, a dialogue with your teachers. So dialogue is just communication between two people, or you're sharing information between two people. And we've had this Romeo and Juliet story, and this is something that most of us know or we've heard of it. So this is an example of drama written by Shakespeare. Okay, we have drama as an example of the type of literature. Do not forget about that. So with dramas, they must be performed. So there's a stage, there are audiences, and there are people who are ready to listen to you. Okay, so dramas are performed. They typically include dialogues or stage directions where someone is telling you do this, do this. So dramas are performed.